This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to ModelCitizenDiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a special bonus episode of Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and this is a continuation of my conversation with Simon Taylor and Guy Jenner. So if you haven't heard the episode from earlier this week, which was released on Wednesday, check that out first. But just a little background for you. Simon Taylor is a veteran broadcaster, publisher, and author. And in fact, he's one of the deans of the UK automotive press. And Guy Jenner is the CEO of HWM Aston Martin Limited, which is the world's oldest Aston Martin dealership, located in Walton-on-Thames, England. So in the last episode, we discussed the HWM racing cars of the late 1940s and early 50s, and the two men who created them, George Abecassis and John Heath. And HWM has the distinction of being the first Grand Prix team to fly the flag for Britain after World War II. So this little operation with very few resources and almost no money basically took on the big boys, Maserati, Ferrari, and so forth. So that was a great conversation, but there was so much more to talk about. Simon, of course, having a 60-year career in the motoring press. And since John Heath and George Abecassis were selling Aston Martins in the 1950s, and the dealership is still operating, Guy had some great insights as well. So the conversation meandered into other areas. For example, Stirling Moss and Lance Macklin, who were up-and-coming drivers in that era. And if you heard last episode, you'll recall that Stirling Moss's first paid drive was with HWM. Now, Simon had a very personal relationship with Stirling, as you'll see, and Lance Macklin is a favorite of Guy's. So we had a great conversation about that, but we also talked about James Hunt, the 1976 Formula One world champion. And if you've seen the movie Rush, then you know the whole story behind that, the rivalry between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. Anyway, the conversation went in directions I didn't necessarily expect, but I am so glad it did, and I know you're going to love this one. So without further ado, here again are Simon Taylor and Guy Jenner. Enjoy.
I think the whole story of HWM is about John and George. It's about two very strong characters, two very different people, and HWM could not have existed without those two people.
With that same relationship, Simon, from everything I've read, it felt like George would often play the pacifier, and particularly, with John and Alf would lock horns in the workshop. He would bring that sense of balance to the business.
Yeah, he did, and he had this wonderfully unobtrusive way of unraveling problems and difficulties. He almost was saying, look, this has nothing to do with me, old boy, but maybe you should think about doing this. And he was a calming influence. And certainly John Heath had a temper, and Alf Francis had a prodigious temper. And it's almost like a soap opera, if you like. It's like a TV series of these different characters, all very individualistic, all very strong. And that's what makes a team like HWM so fascinating. It's not so much the technology or the design of the cars, or even the races. It's the people. The young Stirling Moss, for example. Stirling has always been a man who knows how many pence there are in a pound, doesn't want to spend £2 when £1 will do. But at the same time, Stirling was the man who, after the race, whether he'd run or whether it had been a disaster and the car had broken, he would go quietly, without telling anybody, into the workshop and just put a few pounds into the mechanics' overalls when their backs were turned. Because he knew he didn't do it out of charity. He did it because Stirling would do anything to make sure that his racing was going to be as good as possible. He would leave no stone unturned. This was the man who would start a Le Mans start by doing a sprinter's crouch. And he just thought, if I get the mechanics on side, maybe they'll spend a few more minutes on my head gasket, do it a little bit better. Wonderful. It's great that HWM played such an important part in Stirling Moss's career, and he always acknowledged that.
Do you know the last car that Stirling Moss bought from us?
I'd be fascinated to know.
It was an Aston Martin Signet.
Ah, yes. A lot of your audience, Maurice, probably won't know what an Aston Martin Signet is, but Guy's going to tell us.
I'd be happy to. So it would have been 2011, and Aston Martin were looking at ways to reduce their overall emissions. And they came up with a concept of building their own luxury small city car. And of course, as has always been the way of Aston Martin, they were short on funds, so they really needed a solid base vehicle. And they decided to use the Toyota IQ, which was a small, almost 3.5-seater city car with a 1.3 litre engine. And Aston Martin did a deal with Toyota where these cars would be shipped across from Japan whole, and then Aston Martin would take them apart, put their own bespoke bodywork on the car. They retrimmed the interior beautifully, new wheels. They didn't touch anything from a performance point of view, so it became sort of a chic city runabout. That was the intention. But with it being such a labour-intensive process, it was enormously expensive. So it was probably ahead of its time, because frankly, people weren't spending those sorts of amounts of money on city runabouts. It was £45,000 back then.
By the way, Guy, there was one Aston Martin Signet that was a V8. Do you know where that car is now?
I absolutely do know where that car is, yes. So Aston Martin have this division they call Q, a link to James Bond, and it's the department. Absolutely, yes. It's the department you can go to with your wish list. So Aston Martin, within reason, will create you anything if they've got the time and the capacity within their workforce at that point. And the V8 engine Signet was a great example of that. So I know the gentleman that owns it, who's a great guy and a real supporter of Aston Martin, with an very interesting car collection. But he decided that it would just be hilarious to put a V8 Vantage engine into the Signet. And it took a tremendous amount of engineering to do, as you can imagine. But, I mean, what a wonderful thing. Apparently, it's a little lively with such a short wheelbase. You can imagine when it goes, it goes. But isn't it great that, one, there's a customer, and two, a manufacturer with a sense of humour like that can make these sorts of things happen. I love it. But yeah, Stirling ordered a racing green Signet for driving around central London. He lived in central London and he liked a small, lightweight car. And from everything I've heard, Simon, he used to drive his cars with vigour around the city too.
He certainly did. I, on various occasions, have been a passenger with Stirling Moss when he was driving around London. I've also, on a couple of terrifying occasions, been a pillion passenger on his scooter. You only needed to see him walk down the street to know that Stirling was a man in a hurry. He hated wasting time, and he would rush about. And until the day when, tragically, he got his final illness, and he then was bedridden for 3 years before he died. But right up to the day that he had his final illness, he just couldn't stop rushing about. And he worked constantly. He had the accident that ended his racing career in 1962. And yet he continued being Stirling Moss. I mean, he said, when I kind of came round from being unconscious for 2 weeks after that accident, I lay in bed and thought, well, what am I going to do now? I'm going to have to find another way of earning money. And he was brilliant at it. And he continued for over 40 years being an ex-racing driver when he'd only been a racing driver for 15 years.
In some ways, guys, I feel like it was fortunate that, first of all, it was fortunate that Stirling survived that crash, but also that he chose to retire because he's sort of a bridge between the great eras of motor racing and he became sort of Mr. Motor Racing for the world. He was an ambassador for all of this, and whereas many of his contemporaries didn't survive the era.
Well, that's right. I mean, if you run through the names, it is tragic how many great racing drivers and how many kind of lesser but still valuable racing drivers lost their lives. The interesting thing about Stirling is that he took that decision to retire 1 year after he had the accident. The accident was Easter Monday, 1962. And as soon as he was able to, almost as soon as he was able to walk around, and certainly as he forced himself back to fitness, which he did remarkably quickly, the press, because he was one of the most famous sportsmen in the world, the press were constantly hounding him, when are you going to come back into racing? What are you going to do? And so finally, he went to Goodwood on a slightly drizzly Tuesday afternoon with a Lotus 19, which was an identical car pretty much to the one that he'd crashed, except it was the all-enveloping sports racing car version rather than the Lotus 21, which he crashed. And he went to Goodwood because it was the circuit where he crashed. And he drove round Goodwood at racing speeds to see how it felt. And the lap times he set were very competitive. But he came into the pits, got out of the car, took his helmet off and said, I have retired. Because he said, I was able to do a good lap time, but I had to think consciously about every movement, every gear change, every braking point. Before, I just did it intuitively. Now I have to think about it, and I don't think that's right, so I'm going to retire. He then said to me, about 2 years later, that he'd made the decision too quickly, and that if the press hadn't been hounding him, and he could have spent 18 months rather than a year, maybe 2 years, he then would have come back. And of course, although he worked frightfully hard, having stopped, Stirling would do anything. He would open a supermarket. He would appear on a television program. He would make a speech. He would do anything. And of course did, because he was very much in demand. But things changed a bit for Stirling when historic racing started to become popular in this country really it got going in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And then a man who would have a Maserati 250F, which was ex-Stirling Moss, would say to Stirling, look, we're going to Goodwood. Would you like to drive the car? And of course, Stirling would say, yes, boy, I'll have a go at that. And quite quickly, he ended up racing a lot of other people's cars and racing them very well. I mean, he was then, in his 60s. And then he liked it so much that he bought cars himself to race. Things like a lovely Porsche 550 Spider and a Lola and so on. And he continued racing, and racing well. In obviously the level in historic racing is not as high as the level in Formula One and anything like, but he was competitive. And then one day, it was at the Le Mans historic meeting, the big historic meeting at Le Mans, and he was competing in his Porsche, and it was during practice. He was then, I think, 83. And he was doing good lap times. And he came in at the end of his practice session and got out of the car and said, I'm stopping. I'm retiring again now. And it was because, as he went round, it was a very similar decision. He said he had to start thinking consciously about what he was doing. And he thought, if I'm not careful, I'm going to be beaten by people that I should be beating. And typically Stirling, very strong-minded, very decisive, he just said, stop. And that was at the end of practice. He didn't do that race. He quite happily hung up his helmet.
What an absolutely fascinating man.
A wonderful man. I'm always very proud to say, I mean, I was mad keen about motor racing even as a small boy. I first saw Stirling race on Easter Saturday, 1952, which amazingly, it was 10 years before his final accident. I was, 9 or something, and he was doing a little Formula 3 race at a circuit close to me. And I became a fan immediately. And I've always been fortunate enough to be able to say, I was Stirling Moss's fan for 60 years, and I was his friend for 30. And I'm very, very privileged.
I don't know if either of you have seen it, but there's a film, and I think it was produced by the BBC, that was made, I think, just months before his accident. And it's remarkable because part of it is shot in a car in central London, running around as he's interviewed. Stirling is driving and they're having a discussion. It's in color and it's a wonderful snapshot of the era. And it's available on YouTube. So if you haven't seen it or if you want to watch it again, look it up.
Certainly will.
I wondered whether it might also be okay to talk about James Hunt, and my link on the subject, Maurice, was I wonder whether we could talk about...
Please, absolutely, Guy. And there's plenty to talk about.
I was going to link it, by the way, to Lance Macklin. So I wanted to talk about Lance Macklin, and because I think he was almost the James Hunt of his era. And Lance, his life story is fascinating. He is one of those naturally talented guys in life. And before turning his hand to motor racing, he was part of the British ski team. And then an injury led to him pursuing other interests. And he found himself getting behind the wheel of racing cars. And Lance clearly had that natural balance. I think something that George had said was that he could just turn his hand to any sport because it was just within him. And for me, it feels like he was one of those drivers that was just compelled to soak up the fun side of motorsport. And he spent more time partying and put more effort into partying than he did into his actual racing. But the raw talent was absolutely there. And Moss had remarked that if he'd perhaps just focused a little more on his racing and practice, he might well have been world champion. But I think he's such a fun character. And one of the stories that I heard about him that perhaps demonstrates how much talent he had up his sleeve was when he was racing at the Spa 24-hour. And it was a hot, hot day. And he had a friend watching from a cafe who was drinking a cold beer. And so he gave him the international sign of get one in. And as he lapped, the cold drink was presented there and ready. And so he screamed to a halt, necked the beer, and then absolutely drove the wheels of his car for the remainder of the lap. So much so that he picked up the slack in his times, and his race manager had absolutely no idea what had happened. And it just goes to show that he had that extra talent there and waiting. So for me, and I don't know about you, Simon, but he's a great example of what makes HWM such an interesting race team.
Guy, I absolutely agree, but you made a fascinating point earlier, which I'd like you to expand on, when you drew an analogy between Lance Macklin and James Hunt, both very good sportsmen in all sorts of types of sport, and both racers who love the fun side of racing. Although, one has to say, when James was focused, he was hugely focused, and you could never accuse him of not taking it seriously as you could Lance.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and there are plenty of stories about Lance that are probably not family friendly. But it's fair to say that he made the most of his time off track. And we spoke about Moss earlier and the influences in the team. Moss certainly suggested that he certainly learnt plenty from Lance off track in extracurricular activities. And I've heard Moss interviewed about Lance, and the one word that came up repeatedly was smooth. Lance was smooth.
Stirling said that Lance had, I think he called it the Macklin slide.
Yeah.
He said he saw Lance do this many times. He'd be leaning against a bar, and there would be an attractive girl at the other end of the bar. And somehow, without seeming to move, Lance would slide gradually along the bar until he was standing next to the girl. I mean, I thought that you say the word smooth comes up. I thought the word that you were going to mention, which was Stirling's favourite word, and I think it was probably Lance's as well, which was crumpet.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Probably not a politically correct word to use now, but there's a great story, an HWM story, where there were two races in Italy, northern Italy, a week apart, and it wasn't obviously worth Stirling's while to go back to England or Lance's. So they borrowed John Heath's car which John Heath loved front-wheel drive Citroens. He had a light 15, then he had a big 6. And they borrowed Heath's car because Lance, whose mother had a villa just outside Monte Carlo on the Mediterranean coast, Lance said, there's a lot of good crumpet there, so I think what we should do is let's just borrow John's car, and we can drive up the coast. It's only about 300 miles, and we'll find ourselves some crumpet and then come back in time for next weekend's race. So they shot off, and of course both of them driving like complete lunatics. Stirling always said that their crumpet quest wasn't particularly successful. But anyway, they had to return in time for Friday practice for the next race. When they got back, because of course the front-wheel drive Citroën, it uses up its front tyres before it does its rear tyres. And they'd driven absolutely flat out in John's car. And when they got back, they found that the front tyres were down to the canvas. So when John Heath's back was turned, they hastily swapped the front tyres onto the back and the back tyres onto the front. And John Heath never found out.
What a great story. Love it. Simon, I very much for me with Lance, it feels like he was the James Hunt of his time. And I don't know whether that's something you agree with, Simon, whether you can definitely draw a comparison between the two.
You certainly can. I mean, despite the fact that they're both of different motor racing generations, 20 years apart, they both loved partying. They both loved the fun side of motorsport. And looking back to your quote of Stirling saying that if only he'd taken motor racing more seriously, he could have been world champion.
Yeah, yes.
James Hunt was world champion in 1976. And while he certainly loved partying, he certainly loved chasing the girls, when it actually got down to the serious racing, then James was extremely focused. He was a complicated man, and very often complicated people find it harder to become world champion than very simple-minded people who are just able to concentrate. I mean, James used to vomit before the race. Such was his internal tension. He frequently did that. And his whole approach was not typical of other racing drivers, but it was nevertheless extremely focused, very intense. And once he'd won the championship, which was his great goal, he kind of switched off. And although he remained in racing for a couple of seasons, because if you're the reigning world champion, you can earn a lot of money with your next drive, in the end, halfway through the season, he walked away and was enormously happier once I don't think he was happy when he was racing. He was focused and determined and driven, but he wasn't necessarily happy. And once he gave up, he was extremely happy. I was fortunate enough to share the commentary box with him doing BBC television coverage of Formula One racing. And normally it was Murray Walker with James giving his comments. When Murray wasn't there, it would be me doing the commentating and James giving the comments. And I would always be there raring to go half an hour before the race and frightfully sort of keyed up and dancing around. James would turn up wearing cut-off jeans and flip-flops about 2 minutes before the race started. With a full bottle of white wine, he would sit down. He never stood up to commentate. The wine would be by the side of his chair, and it would be empty by the end of the race. And yet he was such an intelligent man that his reading of the race and his understanding of what was actually going on was superb. He was a very bright man. And his death in his, 40s, from a heart attack was an absolute tragedy, because if he'd remained as a sort of ex-racing driver, an ex-world champion, a personality around motorsport, his comments would have continued to be extremely intelligent and extremely stimulating.
I really kind of enjoy Ford v Ferrari, or as they call it in the UK, Le Mans 66. It's good, but Rush blows it away.
I agree. Yeah. It's got, there's just a fantastic vibe to it as a film.
Well, Ron Howard is a fantastic filmmaker. And I have my bones to pick with some of the choices they made on the Le Mans 66. I felt like they took a shallow route at times when they could have dug deeper and made it more interesting. It's a much more Hollywood film. Rush is a film that I think the thing that they did right with Rush is that it's a film that enthusiasts love. And whereas Le Mans 66, it's very surface in ways that it ought not to have been.
I absolutely agree with you. I worked with Ron Howard on Rush, and he was such an impressive man. I mean, obviously, he's a great director. It was so impressive because his concern was that while he made a movie that would have general appeal, he wanted to make sure that the film didn't offend the enthusiast. And the only reason why I got briefly involved with the editing was because he wanted to make sure that the enthusiast detail was right. Well, I mean, I was fascinated by the whole thing. I was lucky enough to be briefly in the film playing myself as BBC commentator. And it was just a wonderful experience.
That's fantastic. Simon, you were the guy that told the world that James Hunt had won the 1976 World Championship.
Well, I was. This is one of those sort of extraordinary situations of being in the right place at the right time. The point is that, amazingly, in 1976, Grand Prix racing was not live on British television, or a lot of the races weren't live. And the final race of the 76 season was in Japan. And television people, both ITV and BBC, decided that the logistics were too difficult with the technology that was around at the time to do it live. So what they did was they took the pictures, edited them, and put a program out. Obviously, because of the time difference, the race was happening at about 5 a.m, English time. And therefore, their program went out as edited highlights in the afternoon, 8-10 hours after the race had finished. So the only way you could follow it live was by listening to the BBC radio coverage, which was me, both doing BBC Domestic and BBC World Service. So people all around the world were listening to it. And I know that in the UK, people got up early and they turned on their radios and followed the race because they couldn't follow it live on screen. And I could talk for hours about that race because it was a quite extraordinary day. Niki Lauda withdrawing after 2 laps, terrible rain, Hunt leading the race and then nearly throwing it all away because he wore his tyres out. But the point is that at the Mount Fuji circuit, there was a huge scoreboard, a great tower by the start-finish straight, which had in lights the numbers of the top 6 cars throughout the race. In those days, there was no timing screen in the commentary box that told you what the race order was or what was all the stuff that is absolutely essential nowadays. The way you followed the race, if you were a commentator, was you had a friend, an ally, a colleague, with a large sheet of paper and a sharp pencil, and he kept an old-fashioned lap chart. Every time a car went by, he wrote down his number. If 6 cars went by in the spray all at once, you hoped he was writing the numbers down right. And the race had been chaotic, with cars spinning off, cars being lapped, cars making pit stops. It was a complete muddle. And my colleague, journalist colleague of mine, kept his eyes on looking out of the window into the spray and writing down his numbers. And we got to the closing stages, the last lap, and James Hunt had to finish 3rd in order to be champion, to beat Niki Lauda's total. And on the scoreboard, his number was in 5th place. And James himself, driving round, could see that. And he was driving round in a rage because the strategy had all gone wrong. He had to make a tyre change. And he could see the scoreboard, and he could see his number, and it said that he was 5th. My lap charter had him in 3rd place. So I had to take a decision on that final lap, being listened to all the way around the world on live radio. Was my lap charter right, or was the official scoreboard right? And I made a lightning decision, and I decided to follow my own lap charter. So the race finished. Mario Andretti won it. James Hunt crossed the line a few cars later. I said, James Hunt is the champion of the world. And of course, if my lap charter had been wrong and the official scoreboard had been right, that would have been the end of my rather short broadcasting career. Fortunately, about 10 seconds after I'd said that, the scoreboard was changed because they realised they'd made an error, and they showed James Hunt in 3rd place. James Hunt came into the pits in a rage because he thought it had all gone wrong and he'd lost the World Championship. And there was a famous photograph taken from behind by a British photographer called David Phipps, who happened to be standing in the pits, and Hunt came in and he took a picture behind of Hunt clambering out of his car in a great rage, and Teddy Mayer, the McLaren team manager, holding up 3 fingers in his face. You're third, you're champion. So that's my little story of the 1976 Japanese Grand Prix.
Brilliant. Remarkable.
It was chaos, but it was wonderful, and it was a day that I will never forget.
Simon, given what we've said about Lance Macklin, and it was well known that he was very recreational about all of this, but there was a moment of truth at the 1955 Le Mans that he was thrust into, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether, if he had taken racing a little more seriously, do you suppose that the result would have been different that day?
Absolutely not. My reading of that accident is very clear, and as it happens, it accords to Lance Macklin's version and certainly not to Mike Hawthorne's version. And when Mike Hawthorne published a ghost-written autobiography just when he'd won it was a book called
Challenge Me the Race.
Challenge Me the Race. There was a second book called Champion Year, which he did just after he'd won the championship, both of them ghost-written. But yes, in Challenge Me the Race, Hawthorne describes the accident in such a way that absolves him of blame himself, but also seems to indicate that Macklin was at least partly at fault. Macklin immediately started libel proceedings against him, and it was only Hawthorne's death in a car accident in January 1959 which kind of meant that Macklin had really no one to pursue, and that was the end of it. But what happened in the accident, I think, can be blamed on 2 things. It can be blamed on the fact that the Le Mans circuit, and specifically where the pits were, the road was narrow but very quick, because from Whitehouse up to the Dunlop curve, the road was effectively straight, so it was flat out. And yet it was a slight curve. And the pits in those days, it seems extraordinary now, but the pits were simply a white line drawn on the side of the road. There was no protection for the people in the pits, and the road was narrow. And Hawthorne was in the lead. It was about 6:30 in the afternoon. He'd been fighting the Mercedes of Fangio. Hawthorne was paranoid about the Germans. He hated the Germans. It was a thing that went back to World War II, I suppose, for him, but he hated, as he called them, the Krauts. And the one thing that he wanted to do at Le Mans was beat the Mercedes. They'd turned up with a full team with Fangio and Moss and everyone else, and they'd won every other sports car race that year. And he was determined to beat them in his green Jaguar. And he was in the lead. Fangio was in second place. The race had been going for about 2.5 hours. And Hawthorne realised, as he came up towards the pits, he realised rather late that it was time for him to stop at the pits. Coming up behind Lance Macklin were 2 Mercedes, one of Pierre Levesque and one of Fangio. Fangio was on the same lap. Fangio was therefore in second place. And at the last moment, Hawthorne put up his hand and swerved into the pit lane. He did so right in front of Lance Macklin. Lance Macklin was given no opportunity to do anything except to swerve left to miss the back of the Jaguar that was going across him. Pierre Levesque was coming so close up behind Lance Macklin that he was unable to do anything more. And his Mercedes rode up the back of Macklin's car and cartwheeled into the crowd with the terrible result we know. And Fangio actually drove through a wall of smoke because there was smoke and debris and the whole thing's quite horrible. And Fangio had no vision at all. He just went through the smoke and was lucky and didn't hit anything. But my view is very clearly that there was nothing that Macklin could have done and that he was absolutely blameless in the accident. He was an experienced driver. And it's often said that after that accident, Macklin gave up racing on the spot. That's not true. He then drove an Austin Healey 2 months later in the Irish, the TT at Dundrod, the Irish road circuit. And there was another horrendous accident. 3 people were killed in that race. One of the accidents happened in front of Macklin. And rather in a repeat of what happened to Fangio, Macklin had to drive through a wall of smoke. He did actually do one more race the following year, but not very seriously. But that was really Macklin and motor racing finished. But the Le Mans thing really scarred him. And there is no way that any blame can be attached to him. He was very, very unfortunate to be involved.
I think it's probably fair to say that it pretty much ruined the rest of his life, because I mean he was absolutely a recognised driver in those days, and it was really all that anybody wanted to speak to him about. That, you know, any time Lance would go somewhere public, that is what came up in conversation, and I think it is something that he desperately wanted to get away from, and we saw him become a bit of a recluse in the latter part of his life, really, to get away from the spotlight and that the attention that whole incident brought, and frankly the return of all of the feelings that it conjured up, I guess.
I couldn't agree more. It was a dark cloud that followed him for the rest of his days. The fallout from the 55 Le Mans disaster is almost incalculable in some ways, the human element of it, but it's very tangible with respect to the changes in motorsport.
Well, that's right. Although the changes still took too long. I mean, the dangers in motor racing were fundamentally down to 2 things: dangerous tracks and dangerous cars. And the tracks continued to be very dangerous, and in some cases needlessly dangerous, right through into the 1970s. I mean, for the next 20 years, there were still circuits that were needlessly dangerous. And I mean needlessly dangerous, not so much because of the topography of the track or the challenges of the track, but because of the way the races were run. No ambulances, fire marshals with empty fire extinguishers, just disgraceful incompetence, which cost the lives of drivers who shouldn't have died. The other thing, of course, was that the cars themselves afforded virtually no protection to the driver in an accident. And all of that has changed, but it all took too long to change. The man who was the driving force behind a lot of the circuit changes was, of course, Jackie Stewart, who always reckoned that he was the best man to start the crusade because he was the world champion. If he'd been a lesser driver, then what he said wouldn't have carried so much clout. But he did an extraordinary job in making racing safer.
Simon, I think you have a very unique perspective in this regard, because you were in the motoring press, and Jackie Stewart was pretty sharply criticized.
He was. He was very much criticized by journalists. I mean, particularly the man who was probably the most respected Formula One journalist, Dennis Jenkinson, who coined this horrible phrase, milk and water drivers. I don't know quite where milk and water came from, but at a time when Stewart was banding the drivers together to get them to boycott circuits like the Nürburgring, for example, Jenkinson was enraged by that. He said, danger is part of motor racing, and the drivers who do it have got to accept that. Whereas Jackie Stewart said, needless danger should not be part of motor racing. Motor racing will always be dangerous, but there's no point in being too idle to have a fire extinguisher filled, or give a marshal a proper overhaul, or have an ambulance that's actually got some gas in the tank. All of that sort of thing was needless. And there were 1 or 2 drivers who didn't side with Jackie Stewart. Jackie Ickx, for example, a driver for whom I have boundless respect, loved the Nürburgring and said the Nürburgring is fundamental part of motor racing and should not change. Having said that, it was Jackie Ickx who staged his own protest at the start of the 1969 Le Mans, when they were still having the Le Mans start, where the drivers ran across the road. And because they were running across the road, they would jump in their car and start and not bother to do their seatbelts up because they didn't want to waste the time. And either going down the Mulsanne Straight on the first lap, you'd see cars weaving around because the driver was trying to put his seatbelts on while he was doing 200 miles an hour. Or he would maybe not bother to put the seatbelts on at all during his entire first stint. And that was when Jackie Ickx sauntered across the road slowly, got into the car, slowly did up his seatbelts, and then carried on up the road. Now, that was the race when Jackie Ickx won by about 3 lengths.
And in fact, in the first lap of that 1969 Le Mans, John Wolfe was killed in his Porsche 917, having not been in his harness, and was thrown, I think.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. I said to Jackie Ickx once, you made that extraordinary demonstration. You probably added 2.5 minutes to your race time, and you won the race after 24 hours by 3 or 4 lengths, closest finish that's ever been at Le Mans. What would you have done if you had lost the race by that tiny margin, which you'd used up with your demonstration at the start? And he just smiled and said, but I didn't.
Fascinating stuff, Simon. I have had a ball, and we could probably go another hour, but I appreciate your time. Thank you for being on.
Well, it's been great fun for me because I just love talking about HWMs, and I love anything to do with the history of motor racing. Motor racing has been so rich since it first began before the beginning of the 20th century. It's been great to have a chance to talk to you, Maurice. Thank you very much for asking me.
And Maurice, from me, I've enjoyed this incredibly. As the man at the helm at HWM today, it's a great honour to look after such a special business. And, well, I'm pleased we're in good health today, and the future is looking exciting for the business too.
That's wonderful. The book is called John, George, and the HWMs, the first racing team to fly the flag for Britain. Simon Taylor is the author, and Guy Jenner, managing director of HWM Aston Martin, the world's longest operating Aston Martin dealership.
Thank you, Maurice.
It's been fun. Thank you, Maurice.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Join me on Wednesday, July 26th for a great conversation about classically inspired motorcycles built right here in the United States. If you're into cruising on 2 wheels in vintage style, then I know you're going to enjoy it. And by the way, if you don't yet own a motorcycle, I think the bikes we're going to talk about are perfect starters, really. My guest is Richard Worsham, the founder of Janus Motorcycles. Don't forget to hit that follow button, leave me 5 stars and a quick review on Apple Podcasts. And if you want to get in touch, just go to horsepowerheritage.com, click on the contact button, and that'll get you where you need to go. So until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.